fair to say you see the procurement and the supply chain of temporary workers, contractors tightening overall?
Do you know what? I hope so. And I don't mean that because it's great for my business, because it will, I dare say, give me more work to do. But actually, I think it passed the time when it ought to have been tightened. I think we've been seeing it tightening a little bit over the last few years. This bit of legislation where it can actively transfer a liability to another party in the chain will, I think, just be that extra trigger for it to be a little bit quicker, a little bit more in depth. And even with an end client, they may not need to do a lot of due diligence themselves in, for example, the umbrella, but they will expect the agency to be doing it on their behalf.
So what is it you're advising agencies at the moment about this legislation?
So the consistent message is that they're going to have to up the game on their supply chain due diligence. Trying to not sound like a scratch record is it's the real-time element. So take a look at what they do, what they have on their PSL, probably look to reduce the number of umbrellas they have on their preferred supplier list.
Due diligence?
Yeah, do much more due diligence at the point that they take them on and on a more regular basis. And then probably the third thing to say is also then get their act in order in terms of how they look at the real-time position as well. So perfect world scenario is they've got a contained number of umbrellas that they've done a detailed due diligence on, and that those umbrellas are able to give them some element of real-time comfort in respect of the pay-as-you-earn and NIC operation.
Over the years, and inevitably, we hear of quick fixes, silver bullets, solutions to a piece of legislation that's being introduced, has been introduced, etc. With regards to the Joint and Several Liability legislation, are there any magic fixes? Are there any silver bullets?
It annoys me, if I'm being perfectly honest, because this whole legislation has come around because some umbrellas have tried and failed in many instances to find magic fixes to how to reduce tax liability under the normal course of events. So, this is creating a lot more admin for the compliant end of the market. The umbrellas that are doing their best to operate pay-as-you-earn and NIC properly, the agencies that are doing their best to engage only with their umbrellas, and the end clients that are making sure that they use the better agencies in order to be compliant throughout their supply chain. So there aren't any magic fixes, but we are seeing a few little stories starting to bubble up, purporting to be ways of avoiding the need to worry about joint and several liability. I'm not going to go into detail because I don't want to give them airtime, if I'm being perfectly honest, because if something seems too good to be true, you know what the answer is. All I would say to any agency or any umbrella looking to either get involved in fixes to avoid this legislation is how to avoid it like the plague, if I'm being perfectly honest, because the ones I've seen are, well, probably the best way of putting it is they're getting you out of the frying pan well and truly into the fire.
We've touched on, throughout our chats, about other legislation working alongside this Joint and Several Liability umbrella legislation, which in effect amounts to anti-avoidance. So we're talking about corporate legislation, or we've talked about tax promotion, etc. There is other legislation that's coming in which will have an effect on how an agency looks at an umbrella. And the thing that comes to mind is the Employment Rights Bill. Now, although it's not fully formed and there's been a timetable that's put certain things back, what's your take on that? I know you're not an employment lawyer, but it still does have an effect, and it is part of the advice that you give to agencies and clients. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, it's not the first time that different bits of legislation potentially clash. So what I mean by that is if you look at a situation where an end client engages an agency worker and that agency worker is employed by the agency, it gives a big tick in the box for the Employment Rights Bill because they're hopefully getting all of the employment rights as a result of that contract at the minute. But the end client is then on the hook for any pay-as-you-earn and NIC failures that the agency might participate in, under the Joint and Several Liability legislation. Those two things butt up. So the obvious answer to avoid any issues with the Joint and Several Liability for the end client is to say to the agency, don't have them as employees, have them as workers, or engage those workers through an umbrella as employees, because then that shifts the Joint and Several Liability down the chain to the agency. So long-winded way of getting to, you've got to look at all of this in the round. You've got to, if you're an end client or an agency, you've got to understand what your supply chain is doing from an employment rights bill perspective, from a contractual perspective, from an employment status issue, so that you can properly assess what risks need to be managed and by whom. Because if you don't do that, you'll get caught out, and you'll be surprised when you do.
A due diligence undertaken by an agency also needs to take into account whether an umbrella will be able to adequately deal with the demands and the potential liabilities and responsibilities that the Employment Rights Bill is going to bring in. So you're not just looking at things from a tax perspective and to be tax compliant and you worry about joint and several liability. There are associated liabilities that are coming their way with regards to the rights that employees have and how that's managed, and the liabilities that come around if you get that wrong. So to me, it kind of just echoes your point, is any agency doing its due diligence and planning for the future as well needs to take on board what's coming the way with regards to the Employment Rights Bill.
Yeah, I think you've got to look at the whole lot in the round. And yeah, many of the accreditation arrangements that we have for umbrellas touch on employment rights and all of the things that come with that. They'll need to be beefed up as changes come in, just to ensure that there's no breaches of the Employment Rights Bill once it's finalised, and any changes. We're already hearing about employment status tests, etc., whether they're going to be changed. There's more consultation coming the way there. It's not a great message, but you've just got to keep on your toes and keep up to speed with it all and make sure your due diligence is fit for purpose, not just today but tomorrow.